Struggling with the microphone. Here we go. You're good. Okay. Katie.
Here.
Nathan, Mark Sherwood.
Here.
And Shauna Manthorn.
Here.
Kim McCormick. Here. Bree Woodward.
Here.
Alyssa Kowalczyk.
Here.
Paula Kane.
Here.
Deb Sapia.
You.
And Don Woodworth.
Here.
Good, everybody.
All right, if everybody could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
There's the flag.
The flag is over this way.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United
States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. Next is our student rep.
Okay, good evening. So I'll start with a few updates.
Yeah, you gotta move it closer.
Perfect. Alrighty, good evening, everybody. I'm going to start with some few updates from the surrounding schools in the district. Starting off with the high school. So the high school is starting their auditions for the spring musical, which is Anastasia, and they are taking place this week and next. Saturday, December 7th, Student Council will be hosting a kids' night out for all ages, and on December 13th, the class of 2026 will be hosting a cookie decorating event for all ages as well. Meanwhile, on December 9th, the class of 2028 will have a flashlight candy cane hunt for all ages. December 13th will also be Tacky Sweater Day for the high school, and the 20th will be some of the high school's Mealy Meals events, where students can choose from 3 options. So during the school day, they can go to the Student versus Staff Faculty basketball game, a special edition of the Milkmen Improv team here in the PAC, or crafts and games in the CAF as well. Monday, December 16th and the 17th, winter team photos and senior headshots will take place. Best Buddies had their Friendsgiving the Thursday before break after school, and all winter sports are officially kicking off as of Monday, and the high school has an early release next Wednesday, the 11th. At Atkinson Academy, on December 12th, the Hampstead Middle School ABC Club will visit Atkinson Academy and present an anti-bullying presentation to the students in grades 3, 4, and 5. During the week of December 16th, students and staff will have a Spirit Week with varied themed days and a school-wide holiday assembly later on in the week as well. At Danville, they hosted an academic night last night to help families and students learn more about math and reading programs that are offered at the school. The PTA is hosting a holiday shopping event tomorrow as well in the evening from 5 to 8 p.m. for the kids. And the Student Council clothing drive ends tomorrow. At Pollard had an awesome week leading up to the Thanksgiving break that included a whole lot of creative turkey projects. That week, they had a staff Spirit Week where they had staff drinking out of anything but a cup, dressing like Target employees, Blackout Day, Royalty Day, and Flannel Day. This was just an awesome event that kind of showed off staff and school spirit. They're looking forward to their holiday shop and pancake breakfast this upcoming week as well. At Sandown North, the PTA will be hosting a Little Shoppers holiday event on Friday evening beginning at 5. So it will be held at TLC in conjunction with the town's tree lighting event that will also take place. And staff had generously participated in the Giving Tree program. It is designed to help children and seniors in the Sandown community to have a lovely and supportive holiday. This is the last week of the fall after-school enrichment groups. So thank you to Jen Tuttelbaum, Beth Sommers, Jeffrey Modlish, Sam Houlihan, and Robin Gold for facilitating these fun groups. At TLC, the PTA is hosting a Little Shoppers event tomorrow from 5 to 8 in the school gymnasium, and thank you to all the staff who generously donated to fill the holiday wishes of the program. And the donations will benefit the children and seniors in Sandown. And then wrapping up with middle school updates, winter sports are well underway, and all teams are practicing and games have already begun. The Spelling Bee semifinals are also happening this week, and the finals will be next Friday, December 13th, here in the PAC. The 45th annual Holiday Senior Tea will be taking place on Saturday, the 7th, at the middle school. So students will be performing for the seniors, along with serving them cookies and tea. Many students have been enjoying the various after-school clubs also at the middle school that are going on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And thank you to the SAU staff that have came to the middle school last week and served Thanksgiving dinner in the cafeteria to staff and students. And that is the update. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Right, thank you for that update. Are there any delegates or individuals who wish to speak at this time? No. Okay. Right, we have 2 sets of minutes. We have a regular meeting minutes, and then I'm going to pass down while we're looking at that some non-public. Yeah, I'm going to get a motion to move the 30 minutes of delegates and individuals to the end of the meeting.
So moved.
Moved by Shauna, seconded by Mark. Oops. All those in favor? Opposed? And abstain. All right. So again, we'll look at the public meeting minutes of November 21st.
make a motion to approve those minutes, November 21st.
Jack makes a motion to approve. Who seconded? Bree seconded. All right, any discussion on these November 21st meeting minutes? All right, all those in favor? Opposed and abstained. All right, cool. Next, moving on to the non-public that you have in front of you.
Motion to approve the non-public session minutes from November 21st, 2024.
I have a motion made by Shauna. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Alyssa. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Opposed and abstained. All right, if you could pass those back. Now, we do have the New Hampshire Funding Fairness Project that's going to go on tonight. We are going to get through all of our business. We will not close the meeting, but then we will allow them to come up. That way we allow plenty of time for that presentation as well as Q&A that we've got set up as well. Right. So, sorry, Sandy. Oh, wait. Current business, the TRHS 2025-2026 Program of Studies. Hello, Mark.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you, sir?
Well, so I come to you tonight asking the board for a first read of the 25-26 Program of Studies. In your packets, you will have the full draft of the Program of Studies. This has gone through first and second read at Curriculum and Assessment Committee. Also in your packet is an executive summary that outlines all of the major changes. So what I tried to do in that executive summary is the bold word at the beginning is kind of the action, whether it's an add, remove, archive, and then it's a course, and then I tried to give a brief explanation of why that action is being taking place. And like I said, this went through 2 rounds at Curriculum and Assessment, but this, as part of the process, it goes to the board for a first read and then a second read later in December, and then it goes to print over Christmas break usually. So I'm just looking for a first read at this time.
Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Yep, go ahead, Bree.
Is this the edited one we discussed?
The edited archive list is not in your board packet. That the edited that Bree and I discussed is last year when we talked about the archive list, Bree wanted a date at which things were archived. So there were classes that were archived last year, so I added 23 to those. The classes that got archived this year was 2024. So we'll just keep a running tally of when those classes get added to the archive list, what year they get archived.
And the reason behind that was then to think of if something became outdated or hadn't been refreshed in a certain amount of time, that we could reason.
Are you asking a question or are you making a statement, Bree? I couldn't hear you. Okay. You speak into the microphone. Okay, any other questions for Mr. Pearson? Someone want to make a motion to approve this for a first read?
Make a motion to approve the Program of Study 2025-2026 for the high school.
Got a motion by Shauna. Do I have a second? Seconded by Mark. He was too fast with the hand raise. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Opposed and abstain. All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next, I believe we have policy. Is that correct? All right, Shauna, I'm gonna let you take over.
So I'm actually going to inform the board that we're going to table moving policy EBCA and GBEB. We're actually going to take that back to policy. Policy committee received an inquiry from a board member yesterday that we were not able to put on the agenda for today to make sure that we've done our due diligence with that particular feedback. So we'd like to table that and bring it back.
All right, motion's been made, I'm assuming, to table
Yes, please.
policy EBCA and policy GBEB. Do I have so Shauna made that motion. Do I have a second? Seconded by Dawn. Any discussion on this? Bree, did you have a question? Okay. All those in favor? Opposed and abstained. Okay, thank you, Shauna.
Thank you.
All right. Did you have anything to add to the policies? No. Okay. And then warrant articles. Again, this is a running theme that we're going to be seeing until voting. Did Sandy or Chris have anything to add to our warrants? No. Okay. Just so people, board members are aware, we did move up, changed a little bit. We did the 2.5% tax cap is now Article 3, and the lease purchase agreement is Article 4, and the fund balance retention is now Article 5. So instead of being at the end, it is now 3, 4, and 5. Any questions on the warrant articles? All right. Again, we'll see more of this as our meetings go on. Administrators report.
Oh, well, thank you. I'll back up just because I'm probably the loudest person at the table. Good evening, everyone. This evening's administrators report, as I promised last time, would try to cover all of the departments that I serve. I will say that I'm really pleased that we were able to present a budget to BudCom for special education that's almost $500,000 less than last year. That is largely due to the efforts of our staff and the contractors that we have brought in to be able to keep our babies in our district as much as possible, as opposed to placing them out of district. The busy and amazing schedule of the PAC, hopefully you saw presented prior to the meeting. This is the most wonderful time of year for all of us, and it is the busiest time of year for our student musicians and our staff. So please don't miss out on those opportunities. As our student representative said, the winter sports season has begun. We want to thank all of our fall coaches for a wonderful season. Great sportsmanship here in Timberlane. I'm very impressed by that. Middle school basketball has begun their regular season, and the first high school event, drum roll please, will be 12-11, which is a home wrestling match versus Spalding. Also be on the lookout for college sports signings in the next couple of weeks. Lastly, we have some reignited interest in our plant operations director position, that being facilities. Some folks refer to it as that. We'll be exploring opportunities to look at different types of interview situations for these reignited folks with reignited interest. We'll just leave it at that. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. Nothing else?
No, we have nothing else to add.
Okay, sounds great. We do have one for personnel report. We do have one professional nomination. Shauna, do you want to do the honors?
I would love to. Make a motion to accept the professional nomination of Shannon Anastasia, school nurse at Sandown North.
A motion by Shauna. Do I have a second? Seconded by Mark. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed and abstaining. Okay, welcome aboard. Committee reports. I'll start with Mr. Sapia.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. I'm a man of few words.
Rare. This is rare. I'm going to mark this moment. Don?
I just want to comment on the...
Talk into the microphone, please.
I'd like to comment on the curriculum instruction work that was done to prepare the program of studies. I was very impressed with the work that Mark did to not just enter the changes, but to explain them well. The committee had full support of the work that was done by the staff and by Mark, and some of the efforts they've made to even create new opportunities for engineering, which we had been concerned about losing. So they're in the process of fast-tracking a couple of courses for us, which will be in the program of studies, and that work will be completed and approved by the board when it's done. So I'm pretty excited about the effort of some teachers who stepped up to make that possible.
Thank you, Don. Paul?
I don't have it.
Nice. Alyssa?
I don't have anything.
Bree?
I got nothing.
Man. Kim?
Dawn just did our CNA update, so I'm good.
Uh-oh, I have something to say.
Go, Shauna, go.
Shocking, I know, I'm sorry. Policy committee meeting met today and had a really great conversation. We did get through the agenda. We don't have anything quite ready to move forward to the board. We're reaching out to some folks in the district for their expertise related to some of the language. But our next policy committee meeting will not be on the first Thursday of the month due to, we wouldn't have a quorum. So it will be on Monday, January 6th at 5 p.m.
Okay. Thank you,
That's
Shauna.
it.
Mark?
We recently just had two of our negotiating sessions unfortunately canceled due to illness, but we will be rescheduling those. We had safety, won't get into too much detail, but we heard how our resource officer was being integrated into the high school and how he was being received and, warmly welcomed by the students and staff. Also, during a brainstorming session, it was discussed how we have a Fire Explorers program currently going on where students can earn credit, out-of-school credit, and the discussion took place to perhaps we're looking into extending this to our police officers and those services as well. So trying to create more opportunities, non-traditional academic opportunities for our students who may want to go into these fields of fire protection or police service.
Excellent. Very nicely done. Yeah, just to piggyback off of Mark, we talked about a lot about how the resource officer, he's been working really well within the schools and has been really integrated, been doing really well with the kids. Administration's been very happy with that. Also, too, we talked about where all the students now and teachers are trained in Alice. We're looking to do tabletop exercises for administrators, such as the principal level and stuff like that. And we're working on the logistics and stuff like that. Budget committee met. We have gone through all budgets. I believe we have another one coming up in the near future, I believe next week on Thursday. And just, talking about when we have our joint budget committee and school board meeting on December 16th. Again, our attorney, Jim O'Shaughnessy, will be there to discuss some of our warrant articles that we have.
And that will be in the cafeteria.
Here at the high school, yeah.
High school.
Yeah, high school cafeteria, because the PAC is occupied. All right, is there any other business at this time? Yes, Mr. Sapia.
Very briefly, I just want to say that Australia has just limited access to social media to anyone under 16 has been eliminated, and I just think it's something that the data is in now, the negative impact that social media is having on our youth. So I think it's something that the board should explore, as well as the entire district. We see the impact that that's having on our students, so I just wanted to bring that up, that I think Australia made a good first step.
Okay. Any other business? Okay. We don't have a non-public session. Again, I'm good before I turn this over to Ms. Alear to talk about the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. We are going to take a brief recess once she goes over what's going to happen next. But we will, whenever the project's done and all the Q&A is over, the board will then ask if there's any more delegates and individuals that wish to speak, and then we will close our meeting. So without further ado, Sandy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Katie. So good evening. We this evening are fortunate to have Casey Neal, who is the Director of Outreach and Engagement, and Zach Sheehan, who is the Executive Director with the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. This is a nonprofit organization. They are not politically affiliated. We have partnered with them, invited them to come join us in an effort to bring information, and this is an educational opportunity for our community. We have heard a variety of concerns being raised through conversation, through visits to the board, conversations happening in our community around the impact of school funding on our students, our families, taxpayers. So we see this as a true educational opportunity to learn together about how the process that New Hampshire has embraced to fund our schools, how that process impacts us as both taxpayers and as students and educators. So we are going to invite Zach, I believe, is going to be presenting to us. His presentation is approximately 45 minutes in length. We are going to allow him to present that in full. That presentation will be followed by a period of approximately 60 to 90 minutes of question and answers. That session will be moderated by Zach. He'll be fielding the questions. We will be up here if there are any questions that he feels he wants to defer to us. We'll direct those to Katie. And we'll pause at the 60-minute mark in the Q&A session to see if we're at a stopping point. And if not, Katie may decide to extend that to 90 minutes after the Q&A session. So we are going to take a brief pause just to reset. I believe our board members are going to join the audience so that they can also view the presentation with you all. Mm-hmm. And we'll turn it over to Zach once we're reset. So we look forward to this. Thank you. All right. Thank you.
Funding Fairness Project. First off, I want to thank all of you and the school board and administration for inviting us here tonight. This is something that we do, a large part of our organization is doing these presentations. They kind of morph and adapt throughout the year as we get new updated data from the state, different hot topics come up relative to school funding litigation or other elements. But this is a large part of our organization is giving this kind of educational presentation to answer some of these fundamental questions around school funding, property taxes, where are these decisions made, and what can we do to maybe address some of these pieces. Before I dive into that though, I want to kind of just give a little overview of who I am, so you know kind of who's up here telling you about this information. I grew up in Concord, New Hampshire. I went to the public school system there. I left the state for a number of years to go to college, and like a lot of high school graduates in New Hampshire, kind of trying to seek opportunities elsewhere. I ended up coming back and getting some work doing some organizing around affordable childcare, some nonpartisan organizing, just kind of talking to folks around affordable childcare, paid family medical leave, kind of financial instability, and meeting really amazing people all over the state doing work that I didn't know existed when I was growing up here, just trying to make New Hampshire and the communities I lived in a better place to live. So I ended up settling back down 2 blocks from my parents, which I never would have thought I would end up there, but I'm here to stay. And I have been doing this work specifically for about 3 years. I've previously been involved in working as a legislative aide in the State House for a few years, kind of understanding the research and drafting process of bills in Concord, and then some other work beyond that. For the organization as a whole, the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, we are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We do get involved in politics, and you'll see we talk about bills and legislative process, but we're nonpartisan. So we do have some things that we are advocating for changing school funding formula, but we are not involved in supporting any candidates or anything like that, just like any other nonprofit. In general, to kind of set a little bit of the stage as I start going through this, what we are pushing for and advocating for is a New Hampshire where we have excellent school systems and schools all over the state. It's so fun to travel around and see different schools in New Hampshire. This is a beautiful auditorium, and it's really fun to kind of get to see the different places, see larger districts, regional districts like Timberlane, smaller individual community schools. And we have a lot of really amazing public schools in New Hampshire, but we also have a lot that are struggling. And so part of what we're kind of like driving towards is how can we work together and help inform citizens, legislators, school board, all of the above, so people are coming to the table and really trying to grapple with these difficult questions of who should pay for schools, who should pay for public schools, what's the responsibility of a school board versus a taxpayer versus a state legislator, and where do those lines end up? Where should decisions be made? At the local level, at the state level? What's that split? And these are really complicated questions to grapple with, but really what we are trying to help motivate and provide research and data for is let's take this really seriously and put in the time and energy necessary to address some of these issues. So with that, I'm going to jump in. And please kind of write your questions down as we go. I might answer them along the way, but happy to answer any questions at the end. So here's just a little overview of kind of where we will be going through the school funding presentation here. And I'm just going to pull it up on my screen as well. And part of what I want to just walk through is outline what I mean by inequitable school funding. So what actually are some of the differences in access to opportunities in different public schools? For example, we want to walk through this term adequate education. Where does it come from? What does it mean? Impact on taxes. At the project here, we think it's really important to be honest when talking about school funding to also talk about taxes. In New Hampshire and in New Hampshire politics at large, talking about taxes is often seen as you either don't do it or you say someone else is going to be raising your taxes. Almost all politicians do that. But taxes impact schools. We all pay local property taxes. They've been rising a lot, especially the past number of years. And schools rely on local property taxes. It's part of the equation, so we need to talk about both of them. We'll go over some of the court rulings that have been happening, some things that are happening even next week in the Supreme Court relative to the school funding lawsuits, and then some of the things at the legislature, and we'll end with a few ways that you can get involved if you're interested. So to start off, I want to kind of walk through an example. So this is data from 2 public high schools in New Hampshire. None of these data points tell the whole picture. Isolated elements are a helpful way to understand some opportunities and some outcomes, but they are a piece of the puzzle. So here we have 2 schools, their third and third grade reading and math scores. These same schools' percentage of students who graduate, almost 100% to under 80%. It's a pretty big drop. Percentage of test takers scoring a 3 or above. So this is for students who decide to take an AP class and then take that extra step to take an AP test to try to get credit in college. Of those students who have already made those decisions, a significant number are getting that 3 or above, under 40% in the other district. You have the average teacher salary here, almost a $35,000 gap. Median household income, also a significant gap between these 2 communities. And lastly, as promised, we'll talk about taxes. The education property taxes, so this is both your local education property tax and your state education property tax, we call SWEPT. I'll dig into that a little bit more later. Almost 3 times different, about 2.5 times different between these 2 communities. And so the impact on an actual home, we just picked a $350,000 home. You can see the community on the right is paying 2.5 times as much as the community on the left. This is Portsmouth and Claremont, these 2 school districts. And this hopefully will start to kind of, what is Portsmouth doing well? What is Claremont not doing as well? Is it that Claremont is not doing something well? Do they care less? Are they putting in less time and energy? Is Portsmouth just better organized? What is some of the elements leading to these disparities? And there's a lot of answers to those questions, and we'll kind of dig into some of them that we think are the largest drivers. This is the total public school revenue for all the schools in the state from the most recently available data, which is last year's data from the state. We spend on average a lot of money on our public schools in New Hampshire. We do. We invest pretty heavily. We have, on average, very high outcomes, very high scores. We always have schools ranked in the best among the country. A handful of schools in New Hampshire every year are ranked very highly. If you look at total amount of money we spend versus total amount of public school students, we spend a lot, on average. Now the kicker is where that money actually comes from. So here, the green pieces in the top left, those are kind of 3 different chunks of state aid. 18.7%. That is the smallest share of funding coming from the state for a public school system in the country by quite a lot. We have a little bit of federal aid. That federal aid also is going to just shrink in the next few years, as bolstered a bunch by a lot of the COVID-related relief funds. The 2022-2023 year still had a significant number of those funds. So what you'll notice is that the largest chunk is local property taxes, over 60%. That share is the largest by any, compared to any other state in the country. And then you'll see that SWEPT, 9.5%, that's the statewide education property tax. We'll kind of keep coming back to that. The reason that that is shaded the same color as the property tax is because SWEPT does not go to the state. It is called a statewide education property tax. It never leaves your community. It is raised, retained, and kept locally. That's been the case for about 14 years. It was originally passed as a state tax, just like any other state tax, business taxes, rooms and meal taxes. That law was changed so that communities keep all of that money. So it is just a local property tax, making the total closer to 70%. So to back up a little bit, how and where did we get this term adequate education? How many people have heard of the Claremont lawsuits? Good chunk, all right. So these are some lawsuits that took place in the 90s. A number of students, taxpayers, school districts got together, and I'm going to very oversimplify these. If I was presenting with one of the lawyers from there, they probably would go into a little more detail. They effectively sued the state and said, you're not giving us enough money for public education. Way too much of it is on local property taxes, and that's creating deep disparities between these districts because we can't all afford the same things. We went to the Supreme Court over 2 rounds over about 7 years, and the Supreme Court kind of came out with 2 fundamental rulings. First is that the state has this duty to provide an adequate education for every K through 12 student in the state, a constitutionally adequate education. And the second principle, right, keep coming back to taxes, is that the taxes used to provide that adequate education from the state, whatever taxes they decide, need to be uniform. You can't have different taxes for different communities. If they want to use a property tax, they can't tax Atkinson more than Portsmouth, less than Concord, right? Equal taxes to provide this state obligation to provide a constitutionally adequate education. Now, the word adequate is not great for what it actually meant in the Supreme Court rulings. They were not thinking of kind of basic, just enough, just above minimum. They were really thinking, and they spelled it out in this quote here in the actual ruling, adequate was this: what do our students need to thrive in whatever environment they're going to school in 10, 50, 25, 50 years, right? So as the justices were writing this, it was, by adequate we mean our students are successfully going through the public school system and moving on to careers, college, whatever path they want to take, and that's what we mean by adequate. So just to clarify that, this was a very kind of expansive, future-oriented ruling. Following those rulings, there was a pretty significant kind of reaction from the state legislature. So the Supreme Court issued these rulings, and they said, okay, legislature, you have to go figure out how to do that and how to pay for that now, because that's the job of the legislature, to control raising money, spending money, making policy. So the legislature decided to go with a statewide education tax, property tax, as a mechanism by which they would raise this new money to expand the amount of money that the state was spending on education. A quick side note, which is just kind of an interesting historical fact, before the SWEPT was decided on, the first kind of pass at, like, how are we going to raise more money as a state to expand our funding, was actually an income tax. It was proposed by a Democrat. It passed a Republican House, and then it went, and then Governor Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat, kind of gave the signal that she would veto it if it moved any further, right? So then it kind of died in the process. And so I just named that because it kind of flip-flops some maybe conventional understandings of the parties we have in New Hampshire today, but it was a very real income tax proposal to support expanded public education funding. Yeah. Wow. Thank you very much. So the statewide education property tax was what was landed on. And they instituted a new property tax, state tax, $6.60. Put it on everyone's tax bill, all that money goes to the state. Whoop. Paired with a new adequate education funding formula. So state collects all that money, and now they're distributing it based on this new formula that they're trying to hit, getting money where they think it needs to go, which means more money to communities that were struggling more, had lower property values, had more students that required more services for various reasons. The interesting thing that happens with that is everyone gets a tax increase, right? But the average property tax bill dropped dramatically around the state. Because now communities that before these rulings had been really struggling and had really high tax rates were getting a lot more relief from the state and were able to lower their tax rates significantly. So you add this tax rate paired with a good funding formula, Effect is the average rates go down around the state. Now, following that, there were a number of kind of key policy changes that happened that have persisted, and we've kind of seen this as a pattern over the past few decades, where there might be some Supreme Court rulings, generate some activity, the legislature feels a little more pressure, put some proactive policies in place, and then things just kind of slowly backslide. So a few key pieces that happened following those rulings. One, remember how I mentioned at the beginning that the statewide education property tax was a local tax? That was a law change. So in the years following the implementation, there were a number of communities that said, hang on a second, we can calculate how much money and I'll use Portsmouth because they've been a part of this as an example, we know how much Portsmouth is paying in our statewide education property tax. It's pretty easy to figure out. We know how much is going to the state. We also can see how much we are getting back in the adequacy formula for education funding. We're giving more than we're getting. So they came up with this clever term called donor towns. Some of you might have heard that, and made an argument that they were donating their money to other communities, and they didn't like that. And they effectively lobbied the legislature to change it so they got to keep all of their swept money, regardless of how much they would have gotten from the adequate education formula. The result of that is a quirk where some communities now have negative local education tax rates. Because if you are keeping your state education tax dollars, but you only can spend it on education, and say you don't have any kids, like some communities up north, some small communities up north, or you have 5 kids, so you can't spend all that money, you just have this expanding pool of cash that you can't do anything with. So the clever trick is, you raise it on one hand, tell the state you raised that money, and then you set a negative local education tax rate, and it zeroes it out. That is being challenged in court. There was another ruling where kind of courts reaffirmed that the state needs to pay for an adequate education in 2006. It was the Londonderry case. And this last bullet here is education costs. Largely, any increase in the cost of providing education, just like a lot of other services in a lot of other industries, almost all of that has been borne on the backs of local property taxpayers. You can see $615 million increase in property tax, local property taxes versus the state only contributing $47 million more. Okay, so I've talked a lot about this education funding formula, so now I'll kind of break down the basic elements of it. First, and these are the most recent numbers, the current year actually is a 2% increase in all of these, but this is what was passed in the budget in 2023. So first you have what's called base adequacy. So every single student in the state gets $4,100. Every school district gets $4,100 per student. That's your kind of first line. Then if that student is eligible for free and reduced price lunch, you get an additional $2,300. This is not to pay for lunches, but it's a marker of poverty. Since we don't have an income tax in New Hampshire, this is not the best, but it's the measure that we use to understand which students are experiencing poverty, because you have to be at or below a certain federal poverty line to be eligible for those free and reduced price lunches. And we know, on average, students coming from families in lower incomes, on average, require additional services. Same with students receiving special education services. We know that those services, on average, cost more than students who don't receive those services. So the state says, you have more cost there, we're going to kick in a little bit more for the students receiving those services. And lastly, same for any students who qualify as an English language learner. Additional services there, additional staff, we're going to kick in a little bit more money. So all told, averages out to just about $6,000 per student that the state is kicking in to provide an adequate education, right? Which is that expansive, future-oriented, comprehensive education for our students to be thriving in whatever environment and whatever year they're in. Now, a quick note on special education services. Here's some data just to kind of, I think, depending on if you've been in and around schools or kind of your familiarity, you might have different understandings of like what types of services and the level of, the range of the level of costs and different services. There were 30,000 students who received some form or qualified for an IEP, it would have been classified under receiving some form of special education services. They can range. It can be a half hour a week, all the way up to a full-time placement. So there's a huge range and a huge number of types of students with different types of learning challenges that might need different types of services. Now, on the flip side, you can also see that the state and federal government paid a very small proportion of that funding, only about 17% for all of those costs in 2022. And on the other hand, a significant number of school districts, a large part of their budget was dedicated towards special education related costs. This is for Timberlane specifically. The function, that is the way that it's reported on the DOE 25, which is kind of the reporting document that school districts send into the Department of Education. And so what you see is, if you remember the slide a few slides ago, this $22,000 on average, right, an additional cost for students receiving special education services is significantly more than the state was actually kicking in. So if we look at the actual difference in the amount of costs related to special education services, and the reason I'm highlighting special education is a few reasons. One is that they're a lot easier to track, right? A lot of these services have state or federal laws attached to them, requirements attached to them, to make sure that our students do receive the instruction, the accommodations, the elements they need to survive, and to thrive just like their peers in a public education setting, right? And they're really important critical services. They also, though, do have a pretty wide range in costs, and they can be pretty challenging to plan for. So we see that the state kicks in $2,100 per student, and it's nowhere near how much the actual average additional cost is. Same with how much it actually costs, on average, to educate our students in New Hampshire. The state says, here's your $6,000, that's enough for an adequate education. School districts around the state are spending $20,000. So this is a chart showing a number of communities, the communities in the Timberlane School District, and then we threw in New London there for a comparison. And so what you'll see is the green bar is the actual average expenditure. The reason that they're all reported the same for the different communities is because you're in a regional school district, and depending on how it's reported, it comes out as, this is just numbers pulled from the DOE, it comes out as the same average expenditure for your regional school district. But what you can see is that your adequacy grant is slightly different per community. And part of that adequacy grant, the smaller bar, right, this is the bar that the state is saying, here's how much money you need, and we're going to give you to provide an adequate education. And every single community up here, and every single community in the entire state, looks like this same exact ratio. The communities that spend the least amount per student, Manchester's always one of them, right, so is Goffstown actually. They still spend over $15,000 per student, 3 times the amount that the state's giving and saying, here's your adequate education funding. Now, the reason that there's a blue and yellow bar, the full amount, so let's look at Sandown, for example, $3,300 plus $1,500, so $4,800 is what the state says, here's our math, number of students you have, different elements and services that they qualify for, here's how much we're giving you per student. But wait, we're gonna see how much you raise with SWEPT, because it's a statewide education property tax. Sandown raises $1,500 per student. The state's gonna take credit for that, because it's a state tax. Take it off the top, now we're gonna give you $3,300 per student. It feels like a scam, it kind of is, and that's why it's being challenged in court. New London, on the other hand, right, no adequacy funding. That's because the amount that they raise from SWEPT, which is a fixed rate across the state, since they have such high property values, they raise well above and beyond how much they would get for their adequacy funding, so they don't get any additional from the state. So this kind of begs the question, okay, so the state is saying here's your adequacy funding. No district in the entire state, big, small, rural, near the Massachusetts border, seacoast, No combination of a community is getting anywhere close to spending what the state is saying is adequacy funding. So what could you actually afford with just the state's funding for an adequate education? We worked with Allenstown a few years ago and said, all right, budget administrator and superintendent, take your budget that was passed by the voters, you're already operating under, take that budget and cut it to fit just what the state gave you for an adequate education funding. What would you need to cut, right? Because there's kind of an implicit argument in here, right? The state's saying, we've given you enough for your adequate education funding. It's $6,000 per student. So whatever you're doing above that is fluff or not constitutionally required for an adequate education. So let's take that budget, that was $12.2 million, and cut it down to the 2.4 the state actually gave for adequate education funding. So here's some of the things they started eliminating. There's another page. Pulling out all summer programs, 3 of 4 custodians, 1 of 2 nurses, both guidance counselors. No more street crossing guards. Here's another page. All substitute salaries. So if a teacher can't come in, class is canceled. Even after all those cuts, Allenstown tuitions their high school students at Pembroke Academy. They can't control what Pembroke Academy charges. So in this simulation, they cut paying for high school. So if you want to send your kid to high school, totally out of pocket from the parent. Even after all of those cuts, they had to cut half of the remaining classroom teachers. So now we are at a situation where grades K through 4 would have 29 students per teacher. Grades 5 through 8 would have 38 students per teacher. One more kind of caveat. Many of the cuts that I showed there would violate state law, federal law, collective bargaining agreements. These student-teacher ratios would violate the minimum standards set by the state that public schools have to follow. Even if you wanted to, in some hypothetical world, you couldn't make most of those cuts. And we've done this with a number of school districts. This exercise is actually part of one of the lawsuits where a superintendent who did this with us 5 years ago went up and said, I'm calling your bluff, state. You can't do this. We can't even keep the lights on for the amount of money that you're giving, that you're saying we're supposed to provide this robust, future-oriented, adequate education with. Okay, so now to dive into taxes a little bit. Just to start off, kind of like a tax rate comparison. Say Timberlane and Concord both wanted to get a new set of Chromebooks, like these ones up here, for their students, for a specific classroom. Google doesn't actually care if you're from Timberlane or Concord. It's the same price. Let's call it $10,000. Timberlane has a property value of $1 million. They can levy a $10 tax rate. There's their $10,000 for their Chromebooks. Concord has lower property values in this example, only $400,000. If they levy the same tax rate, they only raise $4,000. In order for Concord to raise the same amount of money as Timberlane for those same Chromebooks, they have to increase their tax rate 2.5 times. So they're taxing a much higher rate, only getting the same amount of money as Timberlane. And what you can see is that this plays out in real life all over the state. So we have here a number of towns on the left. We tried to pull a few other examples. I think New London's in there again, the New Hampshire average. The equalized value per pupil is this metric that the state uses that is trying to understand, how do we compare apples to apples? How do you compare New London to Atkinson to Warner to Portsmouth to Concord? And what it is it's the amount of taxable property, kind of like the size of your bank account, behind each student that you can tax to raise money for your schools, because we rely so heavily on local property taxes. Such a large part of that pie from the beginning And so how much of that do you have behind each student? So then you can compare a district with 900, 600, 4,000 kids, 82 kids, and get a general sense of the relative property wealth, taxable property wealth, behind each student. And what you see here is that, let's look at New London, for example, compared to Atkinson, right? Atkinson has a little higher than average equalized value per pupil. On average, a little more wealth per student, property wealth. Equalized school tax rate of $9, and they're raising $24,000 per student across the board there. New London has that equalized property value 3 times as high. Their tax rate is only $6, and they're raising almost twice as much as Atkinson. So it's that same kind of example of the Chromebooks, right? If you have that property wealth, you can keep your tax rates pretty low and still generate significant funds for your schools. And what we've found, and a number of other organizations have found, is that this equalized value per pupil, it's not a perfect metric, but it does track pretty closely to schools that have higher outcomes, higher graduation rates, lower teacher turnover, higher average salaries, and lower tax rates. So now kind of for a dollar amount example, how much does this actually cost homeowners, right? Because if you have a lower tax rate, but you have a really expensive home, right? $3 million home in New London, you still might be paying a good amount in actual property tax cash. So here are 2 communities that are currently on the market, or they were as of a few weeks ago. And what we see is the house on the left in Plastow, 2024 market price, $750,000. Their total school tax rate, that's local and state, $15, almost $16 per thousand. School property tax bill, just under $12,000. This house in Meredith, worth more than double, but the tax rate is only a third. And so the total school property tax, $3,000 less than the house on the left. And obviously we pulled an example, right, to kind of help illustrate that point. Not always true, but in many of the communities with significant property value or pockets of very high valued homes, like on a lake, on a seacoast, near a ski mountain, right, that can kind of raise the overall property wealth in the community, can keep their tax rates pretty low and generate plenty of funding for their schools. And so what this does is it has a really significant impact on who pays taxes and how much in New Hampshire. We often like to think of ourselves as a low tax state. I'm sure people have heard the term the New Hampshire advantage. Very deeply ingrained in our identity about not talking about taxes, only reducing taxes, having low taxes. It's kind of how we view ourselves at large as a state, especially on the political level. The thing is, we have a lot of taxes. We just hide and bury them, and they're most often, and the largest portion are the property taxes. So what this is income groups from the left to right, lower income all the way on the left, higher income is over $700,000 all the way on the right. The darkest bar and the largest bar for all these income groups, the highest percentage of your income going to taxes, property taxes. What you can see is that in general, right, these are averages, in general, the more money you make, the percent of your income going to property taxes drops, and it drops pretty dramatically. And so what this kind of shows is we are paying taxes. It's just who's paying, though, and where they live is really, really dedicated and concentrated in these communities with higher property values that are able to keep their taxes pretty low. Some people ask why this says sales taxes, income taxes, because we don't have sales or income tax in New Hampshire. We do, we just don't have broad-based ones. And so this is a national group that does this for every state in the country, and so that's how they classify them. Sales tax, such as gas and tobacco. Income taxes, they classified the business profits tax, which is the largest portion of the business profits tax is paid by really large multinational corporations like your Walmarts, And then the interest and dividends tax, which is the other one up there, is actually getting totally phased out as of next month. And so the impact of that is going to be, in general, the highest savings from reducing that tax will be felt by people making more than $300,000 a year. And I can talk a little bit more about that tax reduction in a moment. Okay, so now to dig into a few of the court cases. How many people have heard about the Conval school funding case? Cool. All right. So this was a case that was filed in 2019. It was filed after the Kentucky Valley, or Conval, school district said, you know what, we really feel like we are not getting enough funding from the state, but we're going to make it more specific. Remember that base adequacy number? The number that, in theory, a student that doesn't require any special education services, is not on free and reduced lunch, is not an English language learner, kind of like this, that base level, right? We should be able to provide an adequate education for that student at $4,100, or so the state says. We don't think we can. So they did a lot of kind of internal math and data to say, how much do we think we need to provide? Because we think transportation should be included in that, because it's not currently. We think building should be included in that, because it's not currently. We think nurses should be included in that, because it's not currently. And so they did that and came up with just under $10,000. They said, we think that's how much we need in that base level. They tried to get a bill filed. They did. It died immediately. So they sued the state. And they ended up getting over school districts, all these ones listed up here, that represent over 25% of all the public school students in New Hampshire. After 4 years or so, they got a ruling from the Superior Court, and the judge said, you know what, you're right. $4,100 is not enough. But I'm not sure it's that $10,000, and I'm not quite sure where the line is, or he was saying, I want to contemplate where the line is between myself in the judicial branch and the legislature being different branches of government. So I'm not going to tell you what that number is. I'm just going to set a new base, a new floor, which was a $73.56 and 1 cent. And he had, you can read all the kind of rationale around where he came from that number. But he took the plaintiff's number and tried to really make it a lot more conservative. One other kicker from that decision, which we have seen, is that he said the state provided no evidence that the current number is enough. I just want to quantify that a little bit. This is after 3 years of this lawsuit. Millions of pages of documents and discovery and briefs. Millions of dollars paying out-of-state law firms from St. Louis. And we don't know how many hours of state employee time at the AG's office in this lawsuit to present no evidence that $4,100 is enough. The entirety of their case has been attacking the plaintiff's number. $9,600 is too much. You added too much for this element of building. They brought in an expert from Arkansas who got on the stand and said, I don't think that heat matter can be considered as part of an adequate education. So no evidence to justify the current number. This is just a little breakdown of where the judge got to 73.56. He took a lot of the numbers, these are the elements on the right that the plaintiffs had included, and he kind of tried to cut them back a little bit to get to what he thought was like a bare floor. So one thing that came out of that ruling that a lot of people kind of jumped to was this rogue judge just said that we should increase school funding by $400 or $500 million, which would be that increase from $4,100 base to the $73.56. What was missed in that was that's not the point of the case. The case is saying the state needs to pick up a larger share, not necessarily that we need to then spend that much more on schools. It's that they should shift that responsibility so we can relieve the pressure at the local level a bit. So just to kind of put that in illustrative form, this is that current revenue chart from before. Here's what it would look like, could look like with additional state aid. So we're not talking about necessarily expanding the size of the pie. We're talking about reallocating where it's coming from to take that pressure off of local property taxpayers to a degree. Now, the next question is, okay, so where does the state get that new orange slice? And that is where a lot of school funding conversations go to die and have for decades. The short answer is, I don't have a silver bullet. And a lot of times people come to presentations and afterwards we'll start kind of asking very specific questions about very specific taxes. And I don't have all the answers, right? We have some up here. There's going to be a number of bills that we propose next year that will try to tackle this question. The main point, though, is that there are plenty of avenues to take, and there are ways to do it that could really take into account who is paying taxes right now, who is being harmed right now, and changes that we make, how to make sure that people who cannot afford to pay more don't pay more. So, some quick examples. We could use the current or the statewide education property tax and change it back to the way it was originally intended, to be a true state tax, right? We could do that. We could pair that with a homestead exemption to take into account people who are living in lower value homes. We could pair that with a program that we currently have in law, a low and moderate property tax relief program. How many people knew that we had a statewide property tax relief program in the state? That's because it is ridiculously underfunded. 2021, 570 claims, $236 on average for property tax relief. The claims have been dropping significantly since the program was instituted in 2007. And in that same year, the average property tax bill, $7,400. Sure, $236 is better than nothing, but that is not property tax relief. That is not property tax relief for people who actually need that relief. So we already have this program, right? We could just expand it. We could make sure that it takes into account any other changes we make. We can figure out how to make sure that folks who cannot afford to pay more do not. I want to talk about these two a little bit more. So the interest and dividends tax, I showed earlier kind of the impacts of that. Folks making over $300,000 in general would benefit from that. But just to clarify kind of what this tax is. It's a tax on earnings from interest and dividends. Some research was done by the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute that showed that over half this tax was paid by ultra-wealthy people and corporations. We don't know because the filings are not public, but we know like the individual filers, right? So these are corporations or individuals that are making more than $200,000 a year on interest. You have to have between $3 and $10 million in assets to generate that much interest to then be taxed. So this is people with significant wealth, companies with significant wealth and holdings. That tax 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, was voted to be phased out. We were generating $135, $140 million a year. As of January 1, that tax is completely gone. There are some people who don't have millions of dollars in savings, but might have a couple $100,000 and might be making $1,000 a year from this tax, right? We could have just adjusted the limits, again, to take into account who's paying, who can afford to pay, and not just thrown out millions of dollars in revenue for folks with significant wealth. So it's a policy decision. As of January, we're losing $140 million a year in revenue. Business taxes. Past 8 years, we've been slowly cutting our business taxes, specifically our business profits tax, which is, again, largely the largest portion of it paid by large multinational corporations like your Walmarts. There's an analysis done by the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute that basically showed it had zero impact on economic growth. Very extensive report. I encourage folks to look into it. But the kicker was that $500 to $700 million that the state did not get in would have been better spent in a whole range of different services that we know have significant returns on investment, like public education or other services. So when you hear, folks have been hearing that this next state budget, the state does not have a lot of good revenues. Departments are already being asked to cut things. There was just a news story a few weeks ago about special education, specific special education aid that is districts apply for. It's a very specific process. You apply for getting reimbursed for students that cost 3.5 to 10 times the average amount. So students that require significant special education requirements and cost significant resources, school districts can incur that cost. Then the next year, apply through a pretty rigorous process to the Department of Education, say, can we please have some help from this dedicated fund? That fund this year, $50 million of approved requests went through. They only had $32 million in the fund, and the state said, we're not going to ask for more money because we don't have money because we're going into a tough budget year. One other lawsuit, almost at the end here, that was filed 2.5 years ago was on the tax side of the argument. So this is plaintiffs were taxpayers, not school districts, not students. And they said, hold on, I thought the Claremont ruling said that if we are to be taxed to pay for education, it has to be equal and uniform rate across the state. I thought that was kind of like the fundamental piece of Claremont too. But for example, the lead plaintiff, Stephen Rand, hardware store owner in Plymouth. He's a regional school district. He pays much different property taxes than Waterville Valley, which is in the same regional school district. So him and the other plaintiffs are arguing, we're paying significantly different tax rates, sometimes in the same school district, for the same services. We think that violates our constitutional rights. They also argued that the state, in order to rectify that, should be spending significantly more money for education funding, and they took into account things like special education costs, really digging into the state saying it's $2,300 per student. That is just nowhere near true, and we know that, and we can document that across the board. They also had a ruling on 2 different pieces. One was the swept piece. The judge basically said, you cannot keep that excess swept. You can't keep excess money. That's a state tax. You can't have negative local education tax rates. Both of those loopholes are unconstitutional. Whoop. The judge also, in this same case, just heard the rest of the argument, the special education funding, the total amount of education funding for school districts at large, about a month and a half ago. We expect that ruling to come out sometime next spring. And then in the Supreme Court, the Conval case is going to be argued next Tuesday, actually, in front of the Supreme Court. And that is the base adequacy going from $4,100 to $7,300. So both those rulings are going to come out potentially in the middle of the budget season next spring. And this kind of gets to, okay, so what? I mean, the Claremont rulings happened. Some of them were listened to, some of them weren't. The rulings that came out from the Superior Court in Conval and Rand, immediately there were some legislators that said, that judge cannot tell us what to do or we're not listening. There is a bill filed for next year to, what was the language? To explore a process for identifying articles of impeachment against Judge David Ruoff, who's the one who issued those rulings. There's another bill that was put in saying that it would be like an official statement by the House to say that the Claremont rulings, saying that the legislature should pay for constitutionally adequate education, are non-binding and the legislature doesn't have to listen. There are also bills looking to increase school funding, to change how SWEPT is administered. And so it really is kind of a, where do we go from here? If there are these new court rulings, the court is going to be very hesitant to say anything more than, here's why we think the plaintiffs are right in either case, and now legislature, you need to go do that. There's a lot of hesitancy around how much teeth do you put into something like that? How do you start to, in other states they've like fined the legislature, but it's a really kind of tightrope, right? Where is that separation of powers? Who's responsible for making sure that the legislature does what the court says? And that's kind of where, as an organization, we really think our role is, which is education around these issues, and then also helping folks understand and see where you can engage in the legislative process. Because from our view, whether or not legislators will increase funding, will sit down and really tackle, okay, how do we address this pretty complicated statewide education property tax with this homestead exemption or a low and moderate property tax relief program, and how do we make sure that works, and where does the money come from, and who pays a little more, who pays a little less. But like actually engaging in that conversation only happens if state level lawmakers feel like they need to do that. It only happens if people engage and say, I think this is important, I think you should work on it. And it only happens if people that are not me say that. I'm paid to do this. I happen to care very deeply about this. This impacts my life and my family's life in a lot of ways, but I am paid to do this. And so there's a specific ceiling at which me saying, this is an important issue, there's a very specific ceiling. You all saying that, you might disagree with me. You might have different perspectives. You might think it's important for a different reason, or think an element's important, but I missed a mark on a different piece. But just expressing that this is an important issue, that you're struggling with how to pay your property taxes, but you want to support your public schools, that you're struggling with what's the role between increasing state funding, but not losing local control, like a school board making these decisions that impact your community. But expressing that this is something that you care about, these different elements, that then kind of gets the ball rolling and helps lawmakers understand this is something they need to take seriously and really engage with. So, in summary, this issue at large is something that affects both students, taxpayers. You can't really separate them. If you try to separate them, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle. It's not a stagnant issue, and I think next year is going to be really challenging in a lot of ways. But it's also not an issue that's black and white. This is not okay, so do you want good schools or lower property taxes, right? There are a lot of complex and creative solutions that could be explored that are not a this or that. It's an unconstitutional system, and the state is the organization and the level of government that needs to address this. I'm going to end with one more thing, if I can open my computer, that we have been working on, and we did recently in Timberlane. So here's just kind of a number of ways that you can get involved if you're interested. One thing we did this fall that was a really cool pilot program was we worked with a few school districts to say, is there a way that we can incorporate learning about school funding, learning about how some of these elements interplay between state funding, local funding, who makes those decisions, some of the disparities that end up arising because of different property tax rates, different levels of funding for public schools. How can we engage students in that? Because we want to know what they think too. How do they feel about this? What pops out to them? We say we're doing this for students, probably should engage them a little bit more and get their feedback, get their questions. And so some of the folks on our team developed a school funding game that we give basically a mini school budget to students and have them try to pick between different things. So different levels of funding for transportation. Do you want your buildings to be new and state-of-the-art or kind of just okay? Are you gonna get Chromebooks in your class? How many AP classes, sports, music? And they go through this whole thing and they get a set amount of points to build their school budget. And what they don't know is that the students on the other half of the classroom have twice as many points as them for the same exercise. And so everyone goes through it, and then we start asking people how much, what do you spend on this? What do you spend on this? How many language classes do you have? Did you guys decide to get a marching band? Just one sports class or sports team, not 10? And then we reveal that they had dramatically different budgets to be working with, but everything cost the same that they were building their school budget with. And some of the things, I'll just read a few of these real quick, that we got out. It was just really cool to see. From some of the students, we gave them like an anonymous form after, basically being like, was this worth your time? What did you learn? How did you like it? One student said, I like that we work together as students to come up to our own conclusions rather than being told a conclusion. The hands-on aspect of the simulation is helpful to conceptualizing the issues at hand. I feel like I retained what I learned better by actually experiencing it. It gave a good demonstration of the challenge state funding imposed on schools and how school funding is distributed. Now here's what I really like too, is that we asked them, what questions do you have? And it wasn't, oh, this was great, you guys are gonna solve it all. It was, how do we change this? Why isn't an adequate education defined better? How have the lawsuits changed the things the way they are? How would this problem be fixed? We know that there's a problem, but there isn't really been anything done. Are the sacrifices for better education worth the cost? What are the costs and how do we figure those out? And how likely is it that the New Hampshire voting population will support higher taxes in order to provide for better education? If they do not support this, then how will the state budget be divided? What parts of the budget will be cut in order to create a more equitable education? These are the questions we want state-level lawmakers to be asking. They're deep questions, they're complicated, they're taking into account the fact that there are a lot of sides to this issue, and it's not just a simple, more money here, less money here, right? And that has been a really cool experience for us, and it was a really amazing experience for the students here in your district. And yeah, we really appreciate being able to do that, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time here to be here tonight. I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can.
We do have 2 microphones, so if anybody wants to ask a question, please come up to the microphone and he will answer any question that you all have.
I don't need the mic. Is this presentation available to us if we want to access it by computer?
Is this presentation? Yes, it is. I'll go back to, the URL was on the first slide, so, yep, I'll get that back up. Come on up. Ooh. Question was, are the constraints that we're operating under different from other states, and how are they tackling the same questions? It's a very good question. The short answer right off the bat is that no state does it perfectly. It's a complicated issue. Vermont has kind of a flip-flop of us. They have 90-ish% comes from the state. They have a lot of challenges too. It's not a perfect system in terms of how the funds are distributed. Massachusetts has a program where there's a minimum local contribution. So the state says everyone has to have at least I don't remember the exact number, like a $5 per thousand local tax rate. You have to levy that, and then we're gonna top you off up to a certain amount. And then if you're a lower income community or have different qualifiers, we're gonna put a little more in. Again, not perfect, tries to take into account a little more of the how much do you have to actually raise. And if you even look at that program, there were concessions made to some of the wealthier districts that were going to lose out in that transition. Those are some of the ones I'm more familiar with. I think that another element from that is that there are things to learn from other states. And we like to think that we're very unique in New Hampshire, and we are in a lot of ways. But we can learn things from how other states have transitioned through different funding formulas. Pennsylvania just had a school funding lawsuit similar to our Conval lawsuit. The judge ruled in like a 900-page ruling that the districts agreed with the plaintiffs that the districts were wildly underfunded, and a lot of those disparities were based, you could track based on race and economic background. And they issued this ruling, and the state said, okay, and didn't appeal. And so we're gonna try to fix it. And they're now going through this process of rewriting their school funding formula to try to direct a lot more money towards districts with lower standards, with lower incomes, with lower property values. So not as super specific like which state does it perfectly, but there's elements of different states, and there's elements of different states that are in the same position as us, maybe for slightly different reasons, where there's these deep inequities, and then looking to how are they actually engaging with how to address that problem.
In order for us to hear in the broadcast, and for those of us who might have a little hearing impairment, if you raise your hand, I will come to you with the microphone.
Hi, I actually have a few questions. Some of them just are clarifying questions just based on the slides that you had. You said earlier, like near the beginning of the presentation, that federal aid will likely be reducing over the next few years. How does that affect our local and state taxes? Like, who's going to be picking up the slack for that reduced funding?
It's a good question. And I'll offer the opportunity for any school members else to jump in, but the short answer is local property taxes. If there's less federal funding and similar requirements, similar elements that need to be paid for, like special education, for example, and also what we might have seen is that with additional federal funding, some communities might have been able to keep their taxes steady for a few years or maybe increase a little less because of that federal funding. So the short answer is either state or local property taxes, largely dependent on this next budget.
All right. My next question had to do with the first year of SWEP when it was implemented. Was that a uniform rate for the very first year?
Yes, good question. So yes, it was a uniform rate. They were trying to do it in compliance with those recently issued Claremont rulings. It's the uniform with a tiny caveat. The Department of Revenue Administration, and they still do this to this day, they have what I describe as a magic formula because I do not understand it. So it's uniform within like a few cents. So they take into account like the proportion of value that you have for the whole state. So like right now, for example, the swept rate is, and this is actually something I didn't explain, they instituted as $6.60 new tax, right? And then the money raised, they put into the new formula. Now, and the way it's been for about 10 years, is we raised $363 million in swept. And that number is frozen in time. So each year, the Department of Revenue Administration says, we need to raise $363 million. What tax rate do we need to levy on all of our properties to raise that amount of money? Which doesn't make any sense. It's just kind of frozen. And so right now it's like between 85 cents and 95 cents per thousand. It's roughly the same though.
I'm actually kind of jumped then to a question referring to the plan that you had for each of the 4 towns, explaining the tax rates. So as you just explained about, I guess that amount, that 360 million that ends up creating the SWEP rate, does that explain why, like over time, for example, like, by 2023, the amount of the green bar, if you will, on each town page on, I guess be figure 5, 9, and 11, and 13, I believe. Anyway, is that the reason why that amount's so much smaller and the local tax bar is just so much bigger over time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Both of those, both the reduction in the total amount of SWEP being raised, but also once you freeze that number in time, 10 or 12 years ago, right, $363 million in 2024 means a lot less than it did in 2012.
Gotcha. But also you were saying in the slides that, I guess at this point, SWEP is technically not a state tax.
Correct.
So looking at that same bar graph, how much of, I don't know how to word this correctly. So if that green bar is supposed to be swept, right, how much of that is actually still local?
So currently, all swept taxes go from the homeowner to the municipality and stay there. They do not go to the state. And so all of that is, that's why we classify it as a local property tax. None of it actually goes to the state. The state, though, takes a look at how much money they would give you for their adequate education funding, and then asks, how much did you raise when you levied $1 in your community? Okay, it was this much. We're gonna take credit for that, take it off the top of your adequacy funding, and give you the rest. So that's how they're arguing in court. It's still a state tax because we tell people how much to levy, about 90 cents per thousand right now. They do it. They just keep it all. So therefore, we're fulfilling our obligation to fund an adequate education.
Okay, that makes sense. once again, go back to the slides. So for the donor towns that have effectively negative tax rates, what is the experience for the recipient towns? Like, how does that affect their tax rates?
So this is part of this quirk. There's no such thing as a donor town. And there's no such thing as a recipient town because every swept dollar stays local. That was a creative way of talking about the original swept when it was instituted to try to not make it sound like we're a bunch of wealthy towns that want to keep our money. Donor town sounded better, frankly. And so right now there's no such thing as that dynamic. If we were to go back to a true state tax, there would be communities that would send in more money. Although, again, a caveat, taxpayers would be sending in their money. It's not Atkinson's property taxes. It's the taxpayers of Atkinson paying their property taxes. And so if we did go back to a true statewide swept model, some communities, if you wanted to calculate it that way, would be sending in more than they get, just like every other tax we have. So how many people here know how much gas tax revenue Atkinson generates for the state? Is that more or less than how much state funding you get to maintain your roads? No one keeps track of that. That's not how state taxes work, right? This is the only tax in which people are saying, we are giving more than we're getting, creating this kind of donor-receiver narrative.
All right. So since, like you said, SWEPT is technically local, it stays local, who is responsible for making the system the way it is right now? Like, is it local officials? Is it state officials? Is it somehow the federal government? Like, who's responsible?
Very good question. In general, state level policymakers. So SWEPT is a state law. The numbers I put up there for the adequate education funding. Also, I don't know if you caught how perfectly round all of those numbers were. $4,100, $2,100, $2,300. Does that seem like a number you arrive at if you've asked the question, how much does this thing cost, and then you figure it out? No, that was the third iteration of the governor said, I want to do these numbers, he adjusted them. The House said, we want these numbers, they adjusted them. And the Senate said, well, we're going to try to meet you in the middle, and just literally met them in the middle. So to answer your question, it's state level policy. So it's filing a bill, passing both chambers, governor signing it, or just letting it become law without signing it. But it's as simple as just changing the law.
You kind of jumped to my next question, but you're basically suggesting the best way to resolve this issue is at the state legislative level through a bill that it passes through every level and signed by the governor.
Yes, and I think that that's an important caveat or clarification because a lot of times, access to school funding is people think of as through their school board. And school boards do have discretion, right, in how they spend those dollars. They do have discretion working with the school district on what budget they propose to the voters. Voters also have discretion either voting on the budget or for the school board members directly. But to actually change the system in which the school board's operating in, which oftentimes is, as we've seen, very constrained, right, to actually change the overall structure is state level policy making.
One last question. Since you've just explained all of that, just one final question here. As local taxpayers, then obviously we can't just work within our local school district and try to just resolve this with budgets. We have to do other things, correct?
That is the argument that we're making. And I think I'll just kind of use that to pivot in one direction, which also is what I'm not saying is that local debates about how to spend money are not important. What we're saying is we want every community to be on even playing field about those debates. I don't know what you all want or need in this district, right? I might have different views than what I want or need as a homeowner in Concord. I'm also not a parent, right? And so we want to even the playing field from the state to a degree so we can continue to have these conversations, but do that from a place of actually working through what's best for your community, which is different for every community, and not what can we afford without driving people out of our town.
My question's going to be much shorter than those. But I want to thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I'd like to know if you've been able to give a presentation like this to our representatives at the State House.
To varying degrees. So we try. We will do webinars. That's generally a little easier because there's a lot of them. So we'll do kind of like webinars on, what's happening with the lawsuits, how does this impact the legislature, just general ones like this. We also did we've done a series the past 2 elections where we do candidate education webinars. So we don't we don't endorse candidates or anything, but there's 800 people running for the House, and we say, hey, if you're running for office or you're just from the public and you want to learn about this issue, hop onto these webinars. They're moderately successful depending on the topic and the time of year. We also do a small amount of lobbying. We'll pick a few bills and advocate for them. And so we engage with legislators that way. And it can be effective, right? It's way more effective for you all to reach out to your legislators. They care a lot more about what you say than what I do, frankly. But yes, we do try to give this to them, and then this is all available. Always happy to talk to folks.
And I'd like to know if any of our local representatives are present tonight.
I would like to respond to that. I know that at least one of the parties is holding elections, and that's where the representatives are, so they can't be in 2 places at once.
Oh, meaning like a caucus election or something?
For the county.
Oh, for the county, okay. Well, I appreciate you clarifying that.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I did learn a few things that I haven't had the opportunity to figure out on my own. I'm curious, is the state aid based on the voted budgets or the actual dollars spent?
The state aid is based on the adequacy formula that they set.
So is it based off the voted budget? The dollars spent. What I'm getting at is by us having a voted budget and a budget of $91 million, is our adequacy aid and any state aid at all based off of the 91 million?
Okay, I see.
Or is it based off of 91 million minus the 16 million surplus?
I think I'm following, but let me know if I'm not. So the money from the state has nothing to do with what you set for your budget or in any community. They're not looking at saying, we were going to give this much, but you all voted on a $91 million budget, so we're going to do something different. It's how many students do you have, and what levels do they qualify for funding?
Okay, so if the future outlook is as grim as it's sounding, as getting state legislatures to actually do some action here, and they're fighting up in Concord, wouldn't the prudent thing to be to start looking at budgets and cutting budgets to be prepared for less funding from the state? Is that something that other districts are talking about?
I'll answer both of those. So the second question there, is that something that other districts are talking about? Of course, yeah. And I don't know, you might have heard that up in Concord, we're considering building the most expensive school in state history. And that has been very contentious locally, right? Because how much will that cost versus we need a new school, very deeply contentious. Should we even be expanding funding? So yes, of course districts are always balancing, always talking about how do we balance what we have with what our community needs. I think part of what we're trying to do, both to say we think we should do this, but also how can we help as a translator of how to get engaged in the legislative process, is both and, right? You're going to continue to have conversations locally. How much can you afford to spend? Where should you spend it? These are good debates to have locally. Don't give up on advocating at the state level too. And turn to us, and that's one of the resources we provide. Say, okay, well, where do I go? How do I do it? What is a bill? How do I get engaged? Because you all reaching out does make a difference. And it doesn't really feel like it all the time, but one quick anecdote just to kind of a little hopeful. 3 years ago, there was a bill that would have increased funding, basically done the Conval lawsuit. So increased funding from $4,100 to $10,000. That was all the bill said. No revenue attached to it, so the state would have needed to come up with $600 million. I was the only person that testified on that bill. And I testified mostly in support, but I also said there's some pieces that are, would need to be changed about it. Only one person, and I'm paid to do it. No one else showed up. No one, and the committee voted 20-0 to kill it. No conversation, right? Year and a half later, right, these lawsuits and some of the work we've been doing, and frankly, a lot more people just engaging, same bill, same conversation. They created a special subcommittee with 3 different committees from the House and spent like 4 weeks digging into just 4 bills about school funding, which was a lot. And they actually looked at them, they engaged in them, they compromised. The Democrats had one position, the Republicans had another, and they just met in the middle. This is just this past year, and moved forward with a $150 million school funding bill in a non-budget year, which is a big deal. Passed the House pretty overwhelmingly, and then went to the Senate and it ended up dying. But my point being that like the change in why they did that, it's not because I showed up more, it's because other people were engaging and saying, we think this is important, and they really took the time to dig into it.
Mirroring what others have said, thank you for the presentation. I think, when you present charts and graphs and stats, can be a little daunting, a little overwhelming. Also, anyone can skew charts and graphs with real data to support their argument. That's just one of those things that happens with data. But from my perspective, additional taxes are not the answer. What's unique about New Hampshire, and I think is good, those other states you mentioned, Maine, I'm from Maine originally. I would be living there now if it wasn't for their tax situation. Massachusetts, Vermont, those states don't know a tax they don't like. And their school funding is so convoluted because it's buried in all these different taxes, no one even knows what the real value, what the real cost of those school systems are necessarily. They know the budget, but how much of it is being paid by the local municipality is a crazy calculation because it's being funded by all these different sources. In New Hampshire, we know what we have to pay because we're all paying it. And adding additional taxes, whether it's an income tax or an I&D tax or whatever tax you want to call it, it's still coming from us. Maybe not every one of us, to your point. Maybe it's spread to higher income compared to lower income, et cetera. But, I think a lot of those graphs and charts don't take into consideration. I mean, Meredith, areas that have a lot of second homes, probably don't have a lot of children. If they don't have a lot of children, their school costs are going to be less because there's less kids in school. And those people may also own a home somewhere else in New Hampshire, so they're paying high property taxes in the town that their primary home is in. So there's a lot of different nuances, right? And I think also what this doesn't take into consideration is I think some communities probably feel like they're running their school systems very efficiently and maybe at a lower cost as a result. And why should that school system be penalized for another school system that is not running efficient? Timberlane is one of them. I guess we were efficient because we spent $16 million less than we overtaxed our residents in the last year, but I'm pretty positive we'll probably get another budget that's also $16 million overtaxed again like this year. So, I mean, the overtaxation in this town is $5,000 per student. So, that equals what the state pays, but the state is us. And in my opinion, anytime we give more money to a different tax, the result isn't things coming down here, it results in more spending here. To now say, well, that's great, we're getting an extra $5,000, $10,000 from the state. All those wish list things that we had planned, but we haven't been able to sell because, we're really pushing at the edges on what we can get from our local taxpayers, we can now afford to go do that. We can go afford to go build nicer, grander schools. In my opinion, this facility should have never been built. They should have put the money into maintaining the schools instead of building a grandiose facility like this. I wasn't around when it happened. But in any case, adding taxes doesn't result in lowering the burden on the local taxpayer because the school systems will spend more. And I think that's what the end result could end up being. I mean, I've even thought, hey, why don't we legalize marijuana and allocate 100% of it, state control it, just like they do the alcohol, allocate 100% of it to the school system. I just don't think it's going to result in my property taxes going down at all. I think it's just going to increase school spending.
So just bring up a bunch of points that often come up. I think a few ways to think about it are, what I'm most concerned with is who is paying taxes right now. You're right. The state, right, if the state has to pay more, that money comes from largely people or businesses in New Hampshire, right? It doesn't just magically appear. The interest and dividend tax, for example, right? So if we were to reinstate that, people and corporations would be paying that. You're right. So it's, but what we're trying to drive at is who is paying and taking that into account. Because currently with our policy, we are like working as hard as possible to ignore that. You know, cutting the interest and dividends tax instead of adjusting the limits, who benefits from that? The data is incredibly clear. Cutting the business profits tax instead of adjusting the limits to maybe reduce the business enterprise tax for your Main Street businesses, right? Who benefits from that? Incredibly clear. Generally, corporations with a significant amount of revenue, right? And so, yes, they are benefiting from that. So just like increasing taxes, it would come from somewhere, and we're trying to say it should come from, there should be rationale behind where it comes from, right? The same is true for the taxes that we cut. There's rationale behind that, and I just happen to disagree that, that's where we should be reducing our revenue and cutting our taxes. I think the one other element that is, you kind of getting at that local control piece, is that, we can't, our intent is not to dictate that if we were to increase school funding, say somebody's increased school funding bills and Timberlane next year got 10% more funding from the state because the per pupil amount had gone up. If and how the school budget changes, that is all democracy. That is you voting on that, you voting for elected members of the school board, them debating that, you voting for the budget, voting against the budget. That, that's how that works. Some communities will go up, some communities will go down. Some communities would choose to pass all of that on to the taxpayers. Some communities would do half and half. And that's just kind of the nature of the flow of money like that. But really what we want to try to focus on is like, who is paying taxes? Who is benefiting from these? Because there's very specific people, very specific groups that benefit from the way we're currently doing things. And we're trying to say, can we look at that a different way?
Could be that there's a spending problem.
Yeah. And there's a spending decision to be had, just like I said in Concord, right? School board went ahead and started moving forward with a $150 million new school, right? Community was pretty concerned about the process by which it was happening. The school board said we're going to do it anyway. And so the community members said, we don't want to do that. And so we put a ballot measure on to revisit the plans and force them to revisit the plans. The community still wants a new school, but there's processes by which you can kind of engage in that, in the decision-making process. Elected officials are elected, and there's ways in which you can engage in that.
But if the state got us down to the 49%, got us down locally only paying 49%, as you had in the slide up there, that money would not go directly back into the local. It would have to go through a voting process, but then you get the fall budgets and everything else that come into play. It's an impossible dollar-for-dollar trade-off.
I guess the kind of point is, I can't guarantee that if the state provided more funding, 100% of that money would go through to local property tax relief. Because I can't guarantee how every local school district, local school board, local vote would turn out. What we're trying to say is that, I'll give a quick example. Claremont wanted to increase their teacher salaries, the school district, right? They wanted to increase their budget by $1 million to increase salaries because they're bleeding teachers and losing them. They put that up, put it for a vote. It passed overwhelmingly. But that increase, people saying, I will pay more in my property taxes because I want to retain our teachers, that increase hurt a lot more than if Portsmouth asked the same question for $1 million increase. It's a very different conversation. For Portsmouth, 25% raise in your taxes. Claremont, $1.50. They're asking the same question. They're grappling with the same issue, right? What we're trying to say is, why is it so different in those communities when they're asking the same question and putting that same question to a vote of their district about, do we want to raise teacher salaries because we think it's a problem? Let's vote on it, right? Very different conversations in those communities for the same question because of all of these structures and systems we've been talking about tonight. There's a question over here too.
Is your organization or any other group trying to actually define an adequate cost per student in New Hampshire?
Very good question. We do not have a number that we've said this is the number. The two lawsuits are effectively trying to do that, right? They're trying to come at it from two different places. Some of the way we've been approaching that, in part because this is actually getting to these gentlemen over here, like we're balancing, we think that we should be engaging in these conversations. Here's some things who's paying taxes and how, the state's not paying enough, but how can we create a room in which people that maybe sit at boards like this and have a much more detailed understanding than myself about the specific nuances of what adequate education would cost, how do we have that deep conversation? One more piece on that, there was a Commission to Study School Funding 4 years ago that the legislature passed a bill, allocated $500,000 to this commission, which is a lot for legislature. They normally don't pay their commissions. And they met for a year in 2020, hundreds of hours of testimony, stakeholder input. They worked at the UNH Carsey Center to kind of facilitate it and gather all this information. They hired a national data firm to answer that question, to do it updated, how much does it actually cost, who's benefiting, who's hurting. And so they have a more recent best guess, if you will, using a lot of data about what are some of the factors we could do to better allocate and better understand what adequate education is. That research and data has just not been utilized.
And another question, on the SWEPT, right now, all the SWEPT is locally retained. And I think you said there is a suit trying to get that changed back
Correct.
to where the state would take the excess and redistribute it. Where does that stand?
Good question. So that is the Rand lawsuit basically split in two. So the Rand lawsuit, they peeled off that question because it was legally simpler than the rest of the lawsuit, and so they fast-tracked that. So if SWEPT can be retained locally, and if you can have negative local education tax rates, are now one kind of element of the Rand case. That has been ruled on by the Superior Court, and he said, no, you can't keep your excess SWEPT, and you can't have negative rates. It now is at the Supreme Court. They had oral arguments 3 weeks ago, and so we're just waiting for a ruling from the Supreme Court on that piece.
And if the Supreme Court rules that it's unconstitutional the way it is, how does it get fixed?
The legislature needs to pass a bill. So it comes back to, there will be a clear ruling on this practice unconstitutional. And so then the legislature would need to pass a bill or change it in the budget. And there are like 10 bills related to SWEPT that have been filed that do a whole spectrum of things to change it.
I'll just lend some light to that. So Judge Rouet, through the Conval lawsuit, once the lawsuit is over, he could rule that it's the $9,000 figure that we believe it to be as former superintendent involved in that lawsuit. Doesn't matter what figure he puts on it, it has to go to the legislature. You know what's going to happen there. That lawsuit is going to be appealed and appealed and appealed because we're talking almost $500 million to get to that $7,000 figure. it's legislation and lawsuits.
But we're close to the end of the road with those. You know, the
Agreed.
The Conval lawsuit.
Agreed.
Yeah, we should have rulings on the Conval lawsuit sometime next spring, early summer, and the SWEP piece as well.
So I'm confused about the lawsuits though, because if the lawsuits are arguing that an adequate education is $10,000 per student.
In the base costs, that bare minimum. That Conval lawsuit just tackled the base cost, didn't look at special education, free and reduced lunch, or English language, or transportation, or buildings. Just the base number.
Okay. And can you, and I don't know if you're privy to it, but if you take this district's budget divided by the number of students, the average cost per pupil is $28,700 and change, something like that. The data in the packet seemed to suggest that the average cost per student here was $23,000. I understand for whatever reason the state of New Hampshire can't do simple math and apparently applies a bunch of different factors. Can you speak to those factors and why it's not just budget
Total
divided
budget,
by
total
students,
students.
which would be math to me?
I can, it gets a little weedy for me too. We oftentimes try to use the state's numbers to be consistent. And when they have a sheet that they put out that is like cost per pupil. And so we use that because we want to use their data and be consistent. And they don't take into account, I believe, transportation and a few other factors that generally impact that. Like, that's the delta. It's transportation and a few other numbers that are the reason why the delta is, for your example, 28 to 23. So the short answer is we use the state's calculated per pupil expenditure to be consistent across our data.
Okay, one more question. Where does the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project get its funding to operate from as a nonprofit?
Just like every other nonprofit, grants, individual donors, foundations, our like founding foundation was the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, and they're still a donor. But just like every other nonprofit, I spend a lot of my time asking people for money.
Is there federal funding or?
No federal funding, no state funding. We don't get money from any school districts, any state agencies. It's all private foundations, private individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
I was the chair of the school board for several years, so I can't help myself. You may have answered this already, but my concern is that if something like this goes through, you're going to get pushback from the richer towns. Because right now, my understanding is that, say, some of these richer towns would then have to contribute more to some of those poor towns that are not being as well funded, say, in the North Country. How do you think that's going to impact, even if you do get a positive result on your current lawsuits?
So just like everything else we do, involves just talking to a lot of people and trying to engage them in conversations. There's a coalition that is a group of municipalities that have dedicated through their municipal budgets money to pay for what's called the Coalition Communities 2.0, the former donor towns, but they rebranded themselves. And they have, they through their state budget, they put a pool money into this, and then they have town administrators, and they hire a lobbyist and a communications firm and lawyers. They spend about $200,000 a year just not trying to change SWEPT. That's their whole goal. And so what we do is we try to talk to them. We say, if we were to change SWEPT, because we're advocating to change it, what would alleviate some of your concerns? How would we make that, what are you concerned about? And how do we maybe try to craft a bill or work on a solution that would alleviate some of that? One of the main talking points that they use is, just because you happen to live in Wolfboro does not mean you're rich. There are people that live in Wolfboro that live off the lake, don't have $1 million mansions, might have been there for 30 years, and are getting killed by their property taxes. That is true, right? So how do we change a system like SWEPT, where that household, right, Wolfboro doesn't pay property tax, the household does, that household would see an increase. How do we take that into account? Well, we do a homestead exemption, or we increase the limits for the low and moderate property tax relief program so those people are not paying more. It's exactly targeted for what that purpose is. So the kind of answer is engage with them, see what their concerns are, because I think that in general, really blunt, broad-based solutions are never helpful. And if you get something passed, then it might just get overturned. And it's really important to take into account, like, any policy change, some people might pay more. And so being like, can those people afford it? Is that the way to move that forward? And if not, how do we kind of meet in the middle there? But it's definitely a challenge because there would be some shifts.
So you have mentioned verbally and a couple times in your slides the homestead technique that you've just mentioned. New Hampshire already has a homestead allowance. What is yours that you're describing, and how is it different?
So what I'm describing, and I don't actually know if any bills got filed this year. We've been talking to a few folks about filing, but what I'm describing in the case of school funding is if we were to say, go back to a true statewide property tax. So every homeowner, the mechanism might be different, but you're paying your local property tax to Concord, and then you're paying a state property tax bill to the state. The state could set a homestead exemption to say you don't pay taxes on the first $200,000 of your home for that state property tax. So if my home's worth 500 grand, right, I'm only paying the state property tax on 300 grand. So it's a pretty big savings. If my home's worth 2 million, right, I'm paying taxes on the 1.8 million. So that's kind of how you make that tax system a little more progressive. So when I say homestead exemption, it's exempting from taxes a certain chunk, which in general helps people with lower value homes.
I might suggest that because of the terms being used interchangeably and they're not the same thing, you might want to relabel that second one that you're trying to describe.
All right, I appreciate the feedback.
Okay. I think we're good.
Thank you so much. These are really great questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Are there any other delegates or individuals that wish to speak at this time? Okay, seeing that there is none, I'm going to close the school board meeting. Again, I want to thank the New Hampshire School Funding for coming down and speaking with us. Again, this will be available online. I believe we still have some of the handouts in the back. But thank everybody who came to this, and everybody have a good evening.